Upon taking the unwanted Christmas boxes to the recycling bin, we thought of an idea. Could there be a second use for all this packaging? It was like the empty Mario Kart box was telling us something. You guessed it, we're turning it into a Game Boy. The first decision was to choose what type of Game Boy. After some careful consideration, the first thing that came to mind was the Gameboy Pocket, purely because of its simplicity. We knew the task at hand wasn't going to be easy, because manipulating cardboard isn't as simple as it seems. It can easily stress fracture, is flimsy, and it can tear. Our first task at hand was to ensure that the measurements were true to the original Gameboy Pocket. The length, 12.5 centimetres, by the width, 7.5 centimetres. We then went about transferring this to cardboard and doing the initial cuts. Once trimming down the front for the faceplate, we also left some excess for the rear of the shell, which would come in handy later. We then went about creating a rear faceplate for the glass lens. This was similar to the front faceplate, but smaller and would sit behind the front shell and would be glued in. This would ensure that the shell was strengthened and would leave a flush finish for the glass lens. It would also act as a lifter for the front buttons to space from the rubbers. We used super glue as the base as we thought this would be the strongest adhesive for this glossy type of cardboard. Test fitting the lens was successful as we achieved that flush mount look that we were going for. After flipping the shell and tracing the original button orientation, our next task was to gently cut out the button holes using a sharp Stanley knife. In theory, cutting cardboard sounds like a simple task, but you'd be mistaken, especially when making a Game Boy. The slightest little error bubbles the cardboard and tears it. The small cut for the select and start buttons had a tear between the two joints, so we had to replace this and super glue in a small bit of cardboard. We then focused our efforts on creating the rear of the shell, cutting out another width of 7.5 centimetres of cardboard. Creating the rear of the shell was another challenge in its own, due to the number of bends involved, as well as the tight slot for the cartridge and the contrast and volume buttons. Next, we marked out the holes for the power button, contrast, volume, link port, and ear jack. All were extremely hard to cut out and very tedious and time consuming. We felt that creating the rear of the shell would be easier in two parts instead of one long successive part. So the bit of cardboard was trimmed and manipulated to fit the cartridge slot and to create a battery slot compartment. Creating the battery slot was the most difficult part of the build due to the space and alignment involved. We took multiple attempts to trim the cardboard to fit the battery springs, terminals, and for a flush finish. After trimming, re-trimming, and continual trimming, we finally got the battery mount to fit and clear the cartridge slot in one go. We knew that we still had to fit the battery divider for the battery terminal. However, our focus was now to ensure that the buttons fit and functioned correctly. We were pleased with the overall fitment of the buttons and rubbers. However, we still used a modder's best tool, a bit of hot glue to hold them in place. We then added some spacers to ensure that the PCB was lifted above the shell. Once happy with the overall fitment, look and feel of the shell and PCB, we put some temporary glue to hold it in place. As suspected, when trying to fit the rear of the shell, we still needed some additional trimming and manipulation of the battery compartment to ensure that there was a snug fit with the front half of the shell. As suspected, a little bit more trimming needed to be done around the battery terminals on the left-hand side of the shell. We also added the battery spring on the right-hand side of the shell and a battery divider in the middle. All that's left to do is to clean up this enormous pile of scrap cardboard and glue the shell together for its final finish and test. Well, how did it turn out? You judge for yourself. We're pretty pleased with the overall finish. The directional button feels firm and crisp, as do the select start buttons and the A and B buttons. We were also able to retain the original power button, screen bezel, link port, contrast, volume buttons, and ear jack and power source. The power button was a different issue due to the nature of the shell. However, the cartridge slot came out just great. Keeping true to the original nature of the Game Boy Pocket, we were able to retain the battery compartment, which takes 2 AAA batteries. And we were able to retain the original cartridge slot. All that's left is to stand back and enjoy this beautiful handcrafted console. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.